Stockholm, Sweden, August 23rd, 1974. That was the day 4 bank workers, caught in the middle of a failed bank heist, were taken hostage. For 6 days, these people were torn away from their lives and forced inside of a cramped bank vault with their abductors. But on August 28th, when the police arrived to rescue them, they refused to come out. Instead, they begged the police not to hurt their abductors. The captives knew that if they left first, the police would shoot their captors, so they stayed in the vault to protect them. These captives voluntarily acted as human shields for the people who had held them hostage. Why? The media would name this phenomenon Stockholm Syndrome, a concept where kidnapped victims bond with their captors. And while this is an interesting subject that catches popular imagination, it is an incomplete picture. The actual term for this phenomenon is trauma bonding, and it is deeper than the victims simply falling in love with their captors. That is what we will discuss today: how the created concept of Stockholm Syndrome has a deeper level to it, and how the media hiding that level is harmful. Many aspects go into our brain making decisions like those the 4 captives had to make, including mental health conditions such as trauma. As we as a society begin to acknowledge the importance of mental health, it is also important that we recognize just how powerful our minds are. My interest in this subject began when I first heard about it in AP Psychology, and has fascinated me ever since. This drove me to perform individual research to find out more about Stockholm Syndrome. In this speech, we will go over how the media created Stockholm Syndrome, why it happens to victims, and when it has happened. Starting off, we will discuss the first point: how. How did the media create Stockholm Syndrome? It all started with that bank vault case from before. The syndrome was named after this case after people found it hard to believe that the captives wanted to protect their captors. In fact, the public was so skeptical to believe that the victims had sided with the criminals that, according to Stockholm Syndrome, the true story of hostages loyal to their captor, written by author Christopher Klein on History.com in 2019, it was even investigated whether Enmark, one of the bank workers, had worked with the criminals to plot the robbery. We now know how this concept was created, but that still doesn't explain perhaps the most important question: why? Why did the victims act this way? Stockholm Syndrome isn't a medically recognized syndrome. The actual psychological term for this phenomenon is trauma bonding. These terms are often used interchangeably, and they both seek to define when a relationship is formed between a captive and a captor. The media uses the term Stockholm Syndrome, while trauma bonding goes deeper than just the concept. It seeks to explain why it happens. In an academic journal published in 2021 named Trauma Bonding Perspectives from Service Providers and Survivors of Sex Trafficking, a scope and review, written by authors Caitlin Kasana, Logan Knight, and Cecilia Mengo, to describe a theory that states that trauma bonds are the outcome of instinctive survival or coping mechanisms being triggered by the conditions of isolation, helplessness, and kindness towards the victim by the abuser. Whether consciously or unconsciously, trauma bonds are formed as a means of survival. So we now know how it came to be and why it happens. Now let's look at when we've seen it. We've seen examples of trauma bonding disguised as Stockholm Syndrome in the media more than once. For example, Natasha Kampusch, a girl who was kidnapped for 8 years and whose story took the media by storm. In an interview done with the daily British newspaper The Guardian in 2010 with author John Ronson, Natasha Kampusch describes the abuses she went through during those 8 years. She also describes the coping mechanisms that she developed. In situations when I was being bathed, she said, I pictured myself being at a spa. When he gave me something to eat, I imagined him as a gentleman, that he was doing all this for me to be gentlemanly, serving me. She was smart and thoughtful about the way she approached her situation, but as the media began to cover her story, they painted her as a victim. In the same interview, she describes that as she was being victimized, people were constantly offering to help her, but that would stop once she tried to explain the nuances of their relationship. That wasn't the story people wanted to hear, so they dismissed her as suffering from Stockholm Syndrome, a label intended, she says, to deny her ability to judge her own experiences. Now knowing the nature behind these situations, let's take one more look at that bank vault story. Those captives didn't fall in love with their captors. They too were acting in ways to maximize their survival. They believed that they were more likely to die from trigger-happy police than at the hands of their abductors, who hadn't hurt them in the entire 6 days. However, the bank workers trusting the criminals more than the police was such a difficult concept for the public to grasp that they simply dismissed their claims and resorted to victim blaming. At the beginning of this speech, I introduced you with a point of view similar to what the media would share with you. I left out that the abductors had never hurt the victims, but I focused on the fact that the criminals were more trusted than the police. We have now gone over this with a broader perspective. Today we've discussed the origin of Stockholm Syndrome, the psychology behind it, and examples of trauma bonding in famous cases of Stockholm Syndrome. We have explored 2 famous cases of Stockholm Syndrome and the psychology of what went on in the minds of those victims. After hearing my speech today, I want you to think about just how powerful our brains are. We can often put ourselves in horrible mental states and forget that, but we are as strong as our brains are, and that is strong.